Good morning, everyone. You awake? Good on a Friday morning. It's great to see you all this morning. For those of you who might not know, I'm Fritz Mayer. I'm the Dean of the Corbell School. It's such a pleasure this morning to be welcoming the Ambassador of Ireland to the United States for a conversation about Ireland, U.S.-Ireland relations. So we're delighted to be hosting her this morning. Quick shout out to our friend Jim Lyons. Thank you, Jim, so much for making the connection. Jim is deep background in Ireland, but also a number of DU connections, including being on the board of something called IELTS here. And I believe you were here, a friend of Hillary Clinton's. You were here for our Corbell Honors, which is great to see you again. I won't take too much time, but just to note, the specialness of the U.S.-Ireland relationship. It really is quite something. President Biden was just there, and you'll probably talk about that, saying, he felt it, he was kind of coming home to Ireland, and it's become a kind of regular pilgrimage, I think, of American presidents to Ireland, at least many of them. It's reciprocated as well. So my wife, Mary Kay Delaney, Catherine Delaney, coming in the door. And I was just to tell a story. So we were in Ireland visiting her family way in the hills of Tipperary, the Ryans. They live in the new house, which was built in the 18th century, as opposed to the one that was there in Cromwell's time, maybe 19th century. But there in the house was a picture alongside the Pope, of course, of Jack Kennedy. And so there's a wonderful reciprocal relationship. Many things to talk about today about the relationship. Ireland, I just learned, is our ninth biggest investor in the United States, which is extraordinary. You think about the size of Ireland, and so many things that Ireland sort of is more important than its scale, both in the world and in our relationship. Well, Ambassador Geraldine Byrne Nason is Ireland's 19th ambassador to the United States, and she has an extraordinary record of public service. She's was ambassador, permanent representative of Ireland to the United Nations in New York, ambassador to France, second secretary general in the Department of the Taoiseach, ambassador and Ireland's deputy permanent representative to the EU, director of the National Forum on Europe, and I could continue to go on. Incredible, served in Brussels, New York, Paris, Vienna, Helsinki. During her time as the second Secretary General, that was in 2011 to 2014, she was the highest ranking female public servant in Ireland, which is a testament to her long and very prominent service. So we are absolutely delighted that she is here today. I should introduce at the same moment our own Professor Martin Rhodes, who's Distinguished University Professor here at the Corbell School, who specializes in comparative international political economy and European politics, and he'll be in conversation with the ambassador. But first, let me welcome Ambassador to the Corbell School. We are delighted to have you, and I believe you'll make some opening remarks. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dean, and I'd like to welcome the Tipperary woman, Ms. Delaney, into the room. It's a real honor to be with you all here this morning. I must say, I don't know what the opposite of graveyard shift is, but being on a 9 a.m. on a Friday morning stage is probably a stretch. So thank you all for turning up and for listening. And I'll speak to you for about 15 minutes in the presence, I just see, of our own Consul General from San Francisco, Micheál Smith, who's known to some of the faculty and hopefully to the student body, and to someone I described last night as the real ambassador of Ireland in Denver, Jim Lyons, who's Ireland's honorary consul, but who's also done exceptional work for Ireland, in particular in Northern Ireland. So this morning, what I was tasked with was talking to you a bit about Ireland's role on the global stage, and as part of that, I'd just like to knit in the unique relationship that we have here with the United States. Wide canvas, I'll gallop through, and then the important part will be in the discussion, I hope. So I'm just about a year in this seat here, took up this job a year ago. That comes on the heels of 5 years, as the Dean said earlier, as ambassador to the United Nations. 2 of those years I spent representing Ireland at the UN Security Council. And I like to think that in each of those roles, my opportunity really was to create space on the global stage for what is still a relatively young nation like my own. We just celebrated our centenary last year. We're a population of just 5 million people. We live on a peripheral island in the Atlantic, but yet over a century, we have grown into a well-established, and I would say a credible global player. We've been at the world's top table of diplomacy in New York for the last 2 years. We've been an EU member for 50 years. And importantly, we have long-standing and deep bonds with this great United States. That bonding with the United States, of course, based on deep ancestral ties. It's also, and we'll talk to this a bit later, based on shared values, and I think based also on a global commitment to a global environment that supports trade and investment. These are all important constituents of the relationship that we have. And importantly, that relationship has endured through thick and thin. I'll talk about this relationship before I get to the global aspects. So I've been 40 years at this diplomacy, a little bit over 40 years now. And I always hold that it's really hard to qualify, to describe the relationship between 2 countries. I like to think of it myself as a relationship, a tapestry-style relationship, where different threads come together and you see the picture of the relationship building up over time. It's constantly evolving. New threads get added, others wear thin and sometimes tear. But certainly that relationship changes colour. And our relationship, no doubt, with the US is one of the richest and most colourful tapestries we have. It's been woven over centuries. It's been woven not just by migration, which was the beginning of it, but also by, in modern times, by trade, importantly by our music and by our storytelling. In each thread, we are seeing, for me, even from a foreign policy perspective, we're seeing the lives of ordinary people in that people-to-people relationship that actually build up the bedrock of the US-Irish relationship. Many cases for Irish people, we see that in terms of the Irish people who left our shores not by choice, but in search of opportunity. And tomorrow I will be in Leadville remarking on some of the more vulnerable of the Irish who left our shores, remembering what they did to contribute to the development of the United States. But now we're seeing the descendants of those migrants in numbering millions, and they still, happily for us, hold Ireland not just in their hearts, but actually want to stay connected and do business with us. Those migrants helped to build America into the global power she is today. John F. Kennedy, quoted earlier, said, "No country contributed more to building my own than your sons and daughters." And I'll tell you, as an Irish diplomat, we own that history and we work it every single day. Now, in the 21st century, in that US-Ireland relationship, we're seeing those new threads come more into view. The people who are crossing the Atlantic these days are involved in business, they're involved in education, they're involved in tourism. They're not actually travelling, thankfully, anymore in the steerage of coffin ships, which was the case of the 19th century emigrants, much more likely to be in business class seats on Aer Lingus. And I'm thrilled that Aer Lingus will soon have a direct flight from Denver into Dublin. So we're very much 21st century partners. I mentioned values earlier on, but also remembering that those 21st century ambitions are anchored in a historical relationship. But that 21st century ambition puts us as a country that sat beside you at the UN Security Council and that is your ninth source of FDI here in the United States. 5 million people, edge of Europe. We rank coming in the top 10 of those countries who create jobs for US citizens. We're in all 50 states here. We're in the high-end job creation in tech, in fintech, in pharma here in the United States. Some of those threads in that tapestry stand out a bit more, and John F. Kennedy is one of those. He's almost the apogee for the shining symbol for Irish America. And I like to just focus briefly on the moment that he came to Ireland 60 years ago exactly this year. He came as, of course, that shining symbol that everything was possible. He was talking here about a moonshot, but think of the moonshot he represented to Irish people 60 years ago. In 3 generations, a family that left the shores of Ireland as poverty-stricken, seeking hope and opportunity here, had reached the White House. So surely that sense of ambition that he brought back to Ireland 60 years ago made, for Irish people 60 years ago, everything realisable. We had just joined the UN in 1955. We, within 5 years, had become President of the General Assembly and run a big disarmament, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, through the UN. We had a princess in Monaco, Grace Kelly, out of Philadelphia, suddenly a princess. It was the burgeoning of a sense for Irish people on the island that we could actually find our feet on the world stage. And when I stepped up at the UN Security Council now 3 years ago, I must say that that sense of hope and possibility that John F. Kennedy brought to the island at the time, 60 years ago, was still alive. I mean, when John F. Kennedy came to Ireland, he spoke of Ireland's, of his ambition for Ireland, the sense that Ireland's hour had come. And for me, as I went to the Security Council to represent my country, it wasn't so much that our hour had come once again, but that we had actually grown into our place on the global stage. We had evolved and we were capable of assuming a role at the Security Council. I will say, just in parentheses, that President Joe Biden's visit to Ireland this year was an exceptional echo of that, not just the sense of the relationship with the United States, but of the sense of possibility going forward for that relationship. And I think the legacy of the Kennedy visit will find reflection in the future in what President Biden did, including in coming to my home county, which is a small border county, County Louth, in Ireland. But if Kennedy's visit cemented his legacy in Ireland, when we stepped up onto the Security Council, we needed the support of 2/3 of the nations of the world to get elected. You have 193 countries in the UN. You need 128 to vote for you. That's a very high bar. We were in a race where, relative to our small size as a country, we were in deep trouble when we started out. It was known as the Group of Death. We ran against Canada and Norway for election. But I think that our positioning relative to our size, as well as our strong relationships with countries like the United States, meant that we were not afraid to speak out. Kennedy talked about us as the protector of the weak and voice of the small, and we took inspiration from that in positioning ourselves for that Security Council race, principled and values-driven, and I always say feisty, and I think that mattered. At the Security Council, we were working on issues from Syria to Yemen, Middle East, Afghanistan, the DRC, all very far from home issues for Irish foreign policy. We also were there, unfortunately, on the 24th of February for the invasion of Ukraine. I think the members of the UN put their faith in Ireland because of that principle-driven approach. They saw also, many members of the UN, Ireland's own history as reflecting their own pathways: famine, migration, conflict. They are the bread and butter issues of the UN Security Council, and although they're painful trademark reminders for us, they helped us in a foreign policy sense to empathise and to position ourselves as partners as we went on to the Security Council. Luckily, we're no longer hungry, we're no longer exporting our children as we did in the past, but we were ready for 60% of the agenda of the Security Council. We also went on to the Security Council very wide-eyed. We maybe could touch on this later, but we are critical of the Security Council as an institution in its own right. It's an anachronistic body, 5 permanent members deriving. I always say Ireland was an elected member, unlike the 5 permanent members who have permanent status with no, as we would see now, democratic mandate to be there. We also objected very much in the functioning to the use of the veto. We made a little headway on that while we were on the council. We could talk to that later. I know that my 15 minutes are running out, so what I'm going to do is just touch on a few of the substantive issues that we brought forward while we were a member of the council. I think one of the things to say to you is that unless you're ready to stand up and speak out and react, you get lost as a voice on a body like the UN Security Council. Something that never made the headlines that we did, that I think is useful for you as students of international politics to know. In May of 2021, I get the years mixed up, so I'm going to have to quickly look, 2022, 11th of May, Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in Jenin. Got some publicity, but the idea that media freedom, wherever it is in the world, whether on this continent or in a challenged area like the West Bank in the Middle East, was not guaranteed. Indeed, that the murder of a journalist would pass unnoticed was something Ireland simply couldn't accept. So we adopted that issue. We immediately insisted on having a meeting of the Security Council. That was actually objected to by a number, particularly of permanent members. I'll leave it at that. We forced a debate, an area formula debate on the dangers journalists suffer every day in this world, and we continued, including with the support of Al Jazeera, to investigate and pursue accountability for Shireen. Sadly, the response has been inadequate, but it was an example of Ireland coming out of the traps, doing something with global implications. Another area I wanted to mention was the work that we did with like-minded countries, Mexico, Norway, both elected with us. With Mexico, we made a priority of our work on the Security Council on women, peace and security. Inspired by our own Northern Ireland's Women Coalition, our belief is that international peace and security instruments are not sustainable unless you have a reflection of your society contributing to them and helping to implement them. Women are not at the peace table. They're not in the room in negotiations in Syria, certainly not in Afghanistan, in Yemen. We worked very closely, made a golden thread, to go back to my tapestry idea, of women, peace and security, hotly contested issue on the Security Council. Russia and China are vehement objectors on that. Another area that we made some significant headway on was on climate and security. Climate is not treated on the Security Council as an issue of international security. We believe fundamentally there's a correlation between instability. If you look at the Sahel and the recent series of coups in the Sahel area, you have to say there is some link, even if we don't understand what it is. We, together with Niger, brought the first ever resolution to the Security Council table, and without getting into all the detail because time is short, we were blocked by Russia. Russia vetoed that resolution despite the fact that it was the first ever resolution on climate and security, and it was the most supported resolution by the whole of the UN Parliament, if you call it that, the General Assembly ever. We worked very closely with Norway on something that was central to our role on the Security Council, the Syria humanitarian effort. Northwest Syria, where there are over 4 million people daily depending on food and medicine to go across a border crossing, Bab al-Hawa. We negotiated night and day with Russia and the United States to keep that border crossing open. We succeeded for 2 years. Sadly, that crossing closed after we left, and has now been put on as on life support is the best way I can put it. We did exceptional work, in my view, on peacekeeping. We were hugely involved in the Iran nuclear deal, trying to pick up what was, I think, an American foreign policy error in walking away from the JCPOA. Iran's nuclear ambitions have been increased and afforded space because of that foreign policy move, which I'm hugely critical of. So that's a sort of a flavour of what we did. I'll conclude because I know many of you would prefer to have a Q&A. I didn't want to end up without saying something even very briefly about the important situation in terms of the island that I love and know best, Ireland. We have a shared island. Northern Ireland is a part of our country that has been supported in the most vigilant, generous way by the United States across the aisle, across centuries, and certainly across good and bad times. The Good Friday Agreement, 25 years old now, for me is one of the US's outstanding foreign policy successes and is very much underestimated in terms of the exceptional nature. With the time I spent in the Security Council, I cannot think of another peace agreement that has lasted 25 years. It's challenged right now. We are in the wake of Brexit, the situation in Northern Ireland where the Assembly and the Executive no longer take their place. They're not running Northern Ireland as a polity or as an economy. Public servants are doing their best to keep the show on the road. We're deeply concerned about the instability we've seen recently, and even more last week by a piece of legislation on legacy, where immunity will be given to those who committed crimes, extrajudicial killings in Northern Ireland. Every human rights voice that you can summon up on the international stage has criticised the British government legislation, and at the moment the Irish government has sought an opinion about whether they should take the British government to the International Human Rights Court to deal with that. I'm signalling that because as a peace agreement it stood out. It was an integral part of what this 21st century Ireland now looks and feels like, and it's under threat. We're deeply grateful for US support and hope it will continue. My last word is going to be that I take my leaf for my mandate from Joe Biden, President Biden's message to us in Ireland when he visited, which is that we look ahead together with nostalgia for the future. So think about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a great honor to be able to spend a little bit of time with you to ask you some questions. What I think would be a good idea would be if I ask you a question or two, and then we open it to one or two questions from the audience, and then I'll come back in with another question or so. I mean, let's pick up on the point that you made about the Security Council. I mean, the non-permanent membership of Ireland on the Security Council was...
Sorry, we never say non-permanent.
Okay.
We were elected.
All right, thank you. As an elected member, is obviously a sign of, as you say, Ireland's ambitious role, ambitions for an important role in the international system. One of the things that interests a lot of people, I think, is the fact that while engaging in the Security Council in a whole range of international policy issues, and also having been a member of UN peacekeeping forces since the 1950s, Ireland, and I'm not sure that everyone here will realize this, is actually a neutral country vis-a-vis many international conflicts, and has been since the 1920s. Do you think that Irish neutrality, it is not a member of NATO, for example, is an asset, or is it becoming a hindrance vis-a-vis Ireland's potential role vis-a-vis conflicts such as that in Ukraine today?
Well, first of all, just to say we are neutral militarily. We are not neutral on principle, and never have been. And we haven't been neutral in relation to conflicts. If you take Ukraine as a particular example, we have been all in, to put it bluntly. We have been working with our EU partners to provide material support to the war effort in Ukraine. We absolutely object to the invasion of a sovereign, independent, small member of the international community by a permanent member of the Security Council. We never saw that before, by the way, at the Security Council. Ireland was one of the first out of the traps at the Security Council to condemn what was essentially throwing the UN Charter out the window. So there was no question of taking a neutral position on Ukraine. We provide material support. We don't provide lethal force support, and this is where our military neutrality comes in, but we provide material support. What does that mean? It means we provide PVCs, we provide food, we provide logistics. We have, because of you referenced our peacekeeping record, we provide a huge amount of demining expertise to the Ukrainians. So our neutrality is not on the conflict, and it's certainly not on the principle. We, as a small island, over time have, of course, lived beside a very big neighbour, and we haven't always seen eye to eye. The original decision in relation to NATO, we were invited to become a member, was that, I'd quote the Prime Minister of the day, I'm not saying that this now explains our neutrality in the 21st century, it explains the origins of it, who said that, you know, a country, we can't really join hands in a military alliance with a country that still occupies part of our island. We have unresolved issues in relation to Northern Ireland, and that, of course, you know, the Good Friday Agreement brought us to an excellent place in terms of accommodating what is a shared island, the term I used earlier, but there was at its origins a challenge to us in joining NATO. We are part of what we call the Partnership for Peace in NATO, so we have our own defence forces, which we are currently bringing greater capacity to. At the moment, we raise them primarily for peacekeeping functions. I would say probably the invasion of Ukraine has sharpened the debate around what our own capacity for our own security, given our geostrategic positioning out there as in the Atlantic. 90% of the important cables internationally pass in our neighbourhood. So we recognise our responsibilities. We're stepping up our capacity for our own defence forces. Our defence forces are about 10,000 women and men, so it's not a significant defence force. But we are also increasing our interoperability and the way in which we engage with that Partnership for Peace with NATO. So it's a more complex picture than is sometimes understood, that we're neutral and we step aside. We never step aside. In fact, it's almost against the Irish DNA. When you think about it internationally, we are very well able to adopt positions. But maybe the last point on this is that I found our positioning as a militarily neutral country exceptionally important to the countries of the UN when they were looking at how we would behave on their behalf. Coming to my sensitivity about being an elected member, we were representing the members of the United Nations who weren't at the table. And being a militarily aligned, let's just take two countries like Canada and Norway that we were running against in that election race, the group of death. They were both having to explain how they would they be dictated to by NATO, for example, in the context of an action that NATO might assume during their tenure on the Council. We were, I think, in a very good principled position to say we judge our positions case by case. We are never neutral in principle, and that values-driven, principled approach actually appeared more attractive. We, you know, Canada lost out in that race. Canada is a G7, big international player, a serious player here. So there's an example of our neutrality.
I suppose as an example of Ireland's soft power in this context, you have taken tens of thousands of migrants from the Ukraine and refugees. I imagine that's very important symbolically for Ireland as well.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, from the brief description I gave you of Ireland's own history, having to leave where you live, not knowing that where the next shelter will be is something that we understand well in Ireland. We're migrants by nature. It's been part of our history. We have now in Ireland over 100,000 Ukrainians. They came to Ireland not to join with family members, I think, which is largely the case here in the United States, but we're 5 million people. So if you think about what that percentage is of our population, they have come to Ireland since the 24th of February 2022. So it's been a huge influx. They have immediately been given accommodation, access to all public services, and the children are in schools. They're largely women and children, but they're integrated. They're, most of those people, the 100,000 women and children who are in Ireland, they want to go home. They're not coming to find their future in Ireland, but they've been given shelter. And I think from, again, our principled, values-driven approach says, what else would we do with people who have been attacked in such an exceptionally brutal way? We regard that as part of an expression of our foreign policy, that our door is open. Ireland, by the way, right now, population of over 5 million, 1 in 7 people on the island was not born there. So that's just an interesting concept. That 100,000, if you applied it here in the United States, would be over 3 million. So,
thank you. If I could move on to the issue, the geopolitical issue that's very close to home for Ireland, which is the Northern Irish situation. And you mentioned that the Good Friday Agreement is 25 years old this year. Tony Blair, Bill Clinton played a major role. The United States was very, very important in negotiating the Good Friday Agreement. And of course, it's been destabilized by Brexit, even to the point where sectarian tensions have been built up again in Northern Ireland as a result of the difficult trade issues that have been created by Brexit and its repercussions. But one of the things that comes out of the Good Friday Agreement is the clause that I believe in the agreement, which says that if a majority of the population in both parts of Ireland agree, then there could be a movement towards unification. In Ireland itself, the main opposition party, Sinn Féin, is the big proponent of unification, of course. And that party has risen in the polls to the point where today it's at 33% in the election polls, compared to the 2 major parties currently in power together, which together have something like 38%. So that's an interesting change in the balance of power. What does that mean, do you think, for the prospects of unification and tensions within Ireland around this issue?
well, look, I'll go back briefly to the Good Friday Agreement to say, owned by the people in Northern Ireland and obviously made for them, but made in America, in my view. And I wanted one more time just to underline the exceptional role. I don't think we would have the Good Friday Agreement without Bill Clinton, without his envoys, like Jim, who's here in the room, without George Mitchell. So deeply grateful for that. Yeah, things have changed. Brexit was a bad idea to start with. Everything shifted forever because of Brexit. I never tire of saying, you heard in my CV, I spent time in Brussels. I was an ambassador who sat beside successive British ambassadors. We think alike. We're northern liberal trade, open market countries. We saw common cause. We used to think alike on most human rights issues and largely on foreign policy. We miss the UK from Brussels. The big impact in Northern Ireland has been really detrimental to Northern Ireland's own security. Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland won the last elections in Northern Ireland. They came in as the largest party. That was a demography that was always going to develop. We could see that coming. The unionist parties are having real challenges dealing with that. They have refused to come to the table. They blame Brexit and the trade aspects. Some commentators say that it's because it's just too hard to accept that now there's a nationalist majority in Northern Ireland. And you're right, we're seeing, a nationalist majority in Northern Ireland, and now evolutionary political development in the south, where Sinn Féin, which came from a very low base and a challenging beginning, separating itself from what went before 25 years of peace. Sinn Féin was traditionally the political arm of the Irish Republican Army. They have evolved in the south to a very successful party. They are the main opposition party in Ireland, and the polls look very positive for Sinn Féin in an election that we expect to happen probably in over 12 months. But that brings me to the important point of the question, which is United Ireland. As a diplomat of over 40 years standing, I'll be frank, I never thought I'd find myself in front of a microphone using those two words together, because it was regarded, admittedly, it was embedded in the Good Friday Agreement. It was regarded as a very long-term, very difficult political prospect. Just last week, my own Prime Minister, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, who leads one of the two main parties in government, said he would like to see, believes most people in Ireland would like to see, a united Ireland in his lifetime. Leo is in his mid-40s, so he's giving a bit of a wide berth to the prospect, but it's a live political issue. We have undertaken recently, I used the term that we prefer at the moment, shared island. We have undertaken citizens' assemblies and discussions around how does this shared island look? Because I think there's a little bit of a misconception about what United Ireland would mean. Would it be a unification like Germany? Would you paste on Northern Ireland to the south and all of the political complexities and downsides of that? You'd have a large unionist population in Northern Ireland who would object to that. Ireland, a very successful third year in a row, fastest growing economy in the Eurozone in the south. What would that kind of political and economic challenge mean for us? Socioeconomically, we're one people. I said to you, I grew up in a border county, County Louth, where Joe Biden's ancestors came from, the Finnegan part of his family. You don't know when you're crossing the border in that county. You move from County Louth across a border, you only realise it, across the border, you only realise it when your cell phone does a peep because you've moved on to another carrier. You don't see a barrier. I grew up with refugees from Northern Ireland in my junior school. We knew what that distance looked like, but in fact the cows go home to lunch now. Over 30,000 people cross that invisible border every day. We are a shared island. Businesses in the south have outlets in the north. We have high-tech companies that have diversified their operations in what we call north and south to excellent advantage for both economies. We are a shared island. We have a single energy market. Our health systems are interoperable, cooperating. We move organs across the border every day. We are, a unified Ireland will be politically complex and a long discussion, in my view, but it is a discussion that's on the table. I'll finish up on this by saying, irony of ironies, that Brexit should be the spark that lights a unification of Ireland fire.
Absolutely. So there's a de facto unification that's been going on for some time.
It's been an evolutionary thing. I think as our economies, I grew up remembering, a Northern Ireland where the roads were better, where the economy seemed to be much better, the houses were bigger, the gardens looked better. We flipped that. So over time, Ireland's membership of the European Union, which I didn't really elaborate on much today, but Ireland's European vocation has seen it go from strength to strength, so that we now have, a huge interest in Northern Irish investment in the south, and equally in coming together in a way that was not the case in the past. I believe we grew up together on the island through Ireland and the UK sitting together at the EU table. That was extraordinarily important to the evolution of our peace on the island and of our economy and our economic integration. Being part of the European Union brought us all into the single market, which now, by the way, not to be in any way underestimated, the Windsor framework, which Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, finally came forward with after several very false starts. We have the Windsor framework. Northern Ireland has the best of both worlds. They remain part of the UK single market, but in my view, much more importantly, they are part of the 440 million people in the EU single market. They can trade there. It is by all the businesses in Northern Ireland, all of the serious political voices want to keep that EU access. The unionists who need, in my view, politically to show Northern Ireland can be a success seem to be somehow a step behind that argument. It's a rational argument.
Absolutely. I have one broad question that I'd like to get your reflections on, and then we can throw it open to questions from the audience. There has been, as you've been saying, an extraordinary transformation of Ireland economically and politically, especially since its engagement with the single market and with the expansion, enlargement of the European Union. One of the things that's happened in Ireland, which is also extraordinary, is the social evolution. So, I remember the 1995 referendum on divorce, which was an extraordinary step for Ireland, a very strict Catholic country. But what's happened since then is even more extraordinary, with recent agreements on single-sex marriage in 2015, on abortion in 2018, in which Ireland has gone to some extent in the opposite direction of the United States in guaranteeing abortion to, I think the limit is 12 weeks in Ireland. These are extraordinary changes, and I guess they reflect a kind of a generational collapse of the influence of the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy in the country. And I think in the last couple of years also, the government has been removing the engagement of Catholic symbolism and so on in public schools in Ireland. So this is a very recent change, secularization and modernization. What are the forces, in your view, behind this sudden shift in society in the country?
I mean, first of all, I fully agree with your description of the radical transformation there has been. Sudden, no. It has taken time. I went to university in 77, 78. Until 1974, a woman who worked in Ireland's public service, so a diplomat like myself, if you married, you had to resign. That was a marriage bar. I mentioned that because the reason that was lifted and what went with that was also a right to equal pay was because of EU membership. It was part of what we call the acquis in joining the EU, is that you had to allow for equal pay for equal work and that there could be no gender discrimination in the workforce. We then grappled, once we got women into the labour market, of course we were grappling with the other structural barriers that were there, and the role of the Roman Catholic Church had really been embedded in our constitution, which is where we faced major challenges, and you've enunciated the three big ones, the right to divorce, more recently the first country in the world to run a referendum successfully on marriage for all, and then the more recent legislation in relation to abortion. We're actually undergoing another referendum soon on the role of women in the home as it's situated in our constitution. How did all that happen? I think, at its origins, certainly the relationship with the European Union. We have moved away from being an island that was isolated and very, very close to a bastion of influence of the Roman Catholic Church that just simply no longer exists. Part of the evolution was because we began to face more into a modern European frame of socioeconomic profile, but also because almost concomitantly at the same time, the Roman Catholic Church faced huge challenges in terms of trust and confidence in society in Ireland, the abuse of children, emerging abuse of women, women's role in our society not being reflected institutionally in the Roman Catholic Church. There's no one reason, but certainly I'm constantly asked here in the United States, as a, particularly maybe because I'm a non-man, that you know, how does Ireland end up being a beacon for the United States in terms of sexual reproductive health? I chaired the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN. I chaired it just before we went on the Security Council, and frankly, there you could see the beginnings of a United States that was beginning to challenge what we had understood of the US positioning on issues like gender, because the word gender, the US would not allow the word gender to be used in the work of the Commission on the Status of Women. It objected also, this is under a previous administration, to the use of the term family in the plural. So those issues that we had just managed to bring really to a position that I'm so deeply proud to represent in Ireland that you've just described to us now, transformed, as opposed to the Ireland I grew up in. But that the beacon that the US has always been for Ireland in terms of human rights, and I believe women's rights are human rights. I'm channeling another great American, Hillary Clinton, but in that beacon is now at best flashing light. We are very concerned about what's happening here on social policy, particularly in relation to women's rights. But proud to represent the country I do today. And to go back to the point of your question, there was no magic silver bullet to this. It took time. And while I was at the UN, where a lot of, particularly countries in Africa, who are now in a governance sense emerging to a place we were maybe 30 or 40 years ago, to your point about the suddenness of this, I constantly say, no, it was not sudden. It was, it took us time and effort to get there, and we don't take it for granted. I'm, absolutely very vigilant about how we make sure that we don't face the kind of challenges that you seem to be facing here now.
I suppose from the outside it looks sudden because you have these very important legislative steps, and then you have a Taoiseach who is openly gay and of mixed race,
yes,
and the youngest, I think, premier ever and so it looks from the outside as though there's a sudden shift. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think how we look may just, the snapshot looks different to, if I give you a small example of why I keep saying there are roots to it, a woman I have, if I'm ever asked about my model in Irish politics, I always mention Mary Robinson. She was our first woman president. She speaks about Ireland in 1974, when we joined the European Union, the Common Agricultural Policy, which was a big source of income to rural areas in Ireland. She spoke about how the money that came into small farms in Tipperary, I'll go back to the Delaney roots, allowed women on the farms to buy washing machines. So that freed up, let's say, 6 or 8 hours a week from hand washing. They used those hours to organise themselves. They went and they became what was known in Ireland as the Irish Country Women's Association. That evolved, in the late 70s into the 80s, into burgeoning political, local election style groups who women got their voice. They grew their voice. It grew through local community grassroots groups right up into electing a woman president. It was all happening in a way behind the scenes through, in a way, step by step. But you're right that the current picture of Ireland, if you juxtapose that with where we were in 1975, it's radically different.
Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes or so for questions. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for your time and your visit today. My name is Kyle Schultz. I'm a second-year security student. I'd like to hit on Irish unification a little bit more. It would seem that Brexit has certainly brought a new reality to the phrase, "our day will come." And I'm wondering, and obviously it could reignite sectarian violence. I'm wondering how you see, if there were to be a move towards Irish unification, how you see the governments as well as the publics of the United States and the United Kingdom responding.
You're clearly a student of politics. Chucky our law. This man has used a phrase that. Were you at Trinity in Dublin?
I studied abroad for a month.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Chucky our law in the Irish language, our day will come, was a byline for the IRA in former times. Look, looking currently, first of all, at the situation on the unification of Ireland overall in Ireland, recent polls show that over 70% of people in the south of Ireland support the concept of unification. And as you said earlier, there is provision for a border poll should the Secretary of State in Northern Ireland consider there would be a majority in favour. It's a very loose term, very hard to define the way it was embedded in the Good Friday Agreement. I think a lot of people in London are very far from considering that it is, to use your own term, a prospective reality even. I should say here that the idea of Irish unification often in commentary in the UK is taken in parallel with the breakup of the United Kingdom as a polity in its own right. We've seen that Scotland has had one run at the fence. Would there be, if there were to be momentum behind a discussion on reunification in Ireland, effectively you're looking at the dissolution of part of the United Kingdom. Therefore, would other parts begin to think there's even, I happen to know just anecdotally, my brother is a medic, lives in Wales, and he says there's a lot of burgeoning nationalism in Wales. So it evokes in the United Kingdom issues that are totally unrelated really to Ireland. You opened your question with a reference to security. I think the United Kingdom probably, needs to consider a little more the impact of Brexit on the security situation in Northern Ireland, but would be very worried about their own security resources in relation to Scotland, for example, where their nuclear bases are very important. So, you're also, just to go back to, has Brexit created insecurity in Northern Ireland? Yes. Straightforward answer, it has. And therefore, we also look in the context of any discussion on the unification of Ireland about what security on the island would have to look like as a function of that. So all that goes to say that I think in the UK, probably the UK government at the moment, very focused on their own survival in an upcoming election. The Labour Party is interesting. You mentioned name-check Tony Blair. Keir Starmer knows us. He knows Ireland. He's paid attention to Northern Ireland when he was in his previous role. He was Attorney General, right? He has had cause to look under the lid in a way that some Conservative politicians have not taken the time to do. So I think under a Labour government, the discussion might look different. But we are currently working as best we can with the UK government. I just want to finish on this point by saying the issue of the unification of Ireland is not something that's on the government agenda every day in Dublin. It's not something that Irish people every day raise. But it is an interesting thing for me that you in the United States are beginning to bring it to our table. And it's also something, frankly, that I get asked about when I go on Capitol Hill. We have an extraordinary group of politicians on Capitol Hill. I want to emphasize bipartisan, which is so rare on Capitol Hill these days. Republican and Democrats co-chair the Friends of Ireland on Capitol Hill and are deeply, deeply supportive of just about everything we've asked since I've seen that relationship grow. It's a real asset. I get asked questions by the Friends of Ireland about the unification of Ireland very often.
Yes, over there.
My name is Geraldine. I'm a first year International Human Rights Master's candidate. I have a question especially about sorry. I have a question about migration, especially because you talked about Ukraine and talked about that there are over approximately 100,000 Ukrainians currently live in Ireland, and especially considering a lot of countries, especially the United States, are hosting Ukrainian immigrants. Do you see that there's going to be a situation where we're going to have a migrant issue possibly happening in Europe with the EU, or is it just because of the war in the conflict in Ukraine currently.
Sorry, can I just clarify your question? Do I see what a migrant issue? Can you just?
A migrant crisis happening.
Oh, a migrant crisis.
Within the EU.
Yeah, look, I mean, big picture, as we all know, I mean, most migration in the world is happening in the south. It's south to south. That's where the big movements of people are. So what we're seeing in Europe is just the tip of the iceberg of a much bigger, and I know you're a human rights student, this is an issue integral to the human rights, I would say, driven perspective that Ireland adopts on this. But we know that, that the migration from North Africa has provided major challenges to Southern Europe in particular. But you also in Europe, what happened with Syrian and Afghan refugees in Germany and the political impact it had, particularly on Angela Merkel and the courageous stand she took at the time. Is there a migrant crisis? There's certainly a crisis in terms of better managing the flow of people from climate and security challenged areas, mainly in Africa, into Europe. I don't think that the crisis in Ukraine is regarded as a migrant crisis. I mean, that issue, you have seen countries step up with great alacrity and really very, very little knock-on impact locally. I mean, we have taken 100,000. If you think of it, we're an island way out there in the Atlantic. We weren't the first port of call for Ukrainians. So there are millions, or over 4 million Ukrainians who have left, who have even more internally displaced, which is a whole other issue. But the ones who have left, the majority of those have been absorbed in Poland and Hungary, in the Czech Republic. Exceptional generosity and accommodation of those people locally. They're not creating major instability crisis in the neighbourhood. I think the challenge on the migration crisis really does relate to what's happening, for example, and you've seen it in people getting into these inflatable dinghies out of Libya and into Greece or into southern Italy in their numbers. We're seeing them out of northern France into the UK, which was in part, which fueled some of the take the UK back arguments for Brexit. So it is being used as a political wedge. It's a political issue. Europe is a big, wealthy continent that is more than capable of absorbing the numbers of people. We need to manage this better. And Ireland certainly, to go back to our own history and our own origins, is always to the forefront in European policy in promoting a human rights-based, ethical, generous migration policy, and we show that in our own domestic policy, but we do see it as a human rights issue, and we want to ensure that EU resources are used in a way, and that there is what is sometimes used in Brussels as a sort of pejorative term, but that there's an equitable distribution when it comes to accommodating refugees. You know, we have vacated the hotels in Ireland specifically to accommodate the 100,000 Ukrainians we have in Ireland. Irish people who have a second country home have been asked to hand over their homes, which they've done. Small payments being made by the government for upkeep, but that's the way in which we are accommodating that. We're at a level of economic capacity that allows us to do that. Is it without cost politically for any government to do that? No. And we see in your country what the political tensions are that can arise. I'm glad to see we haven't seen them arise in the same way in Ireland, in pockets in Europe. But we need to better manage the migration from the south. And maybe I'll finish on this. I mentioned what was really something that we put such store by, our climate security effort at the Security Council table. Migration in the global south largely linked to climate-related displacement. You know, Lake Chad has practically disappeared. Young guys who would become fishermen on Lake Chad suddenly found their only way through as jihadists, and now look where Mali and look today where Libya is. They've moved north. They had no choice. Climate is a security issue, let's be clear about that, and it's deeply linked into the scale of migration and the source of migration that we're seeing from the global south.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands up, and it's 10 o'clock. So it just remains to thank the ambassador very, very much for spending her time with us.
Do I get to ask a question?
You do.
First of all my team, wherever I work, always know my preferred places to be with PLU, with people like you, young people who are thinking ahead. And I'm just curious, are there any of you in this audience who are thinking to a public service kind of role, diplomacy? Great. Oh, way up. Put your hands way up. Okay.
Lost.
That you've just made my day. That is fantastic. If I may make a sort of a commercial for the future of America, you need talent and commitment in behind your public service here in the United States. You know, you're facing huge challenges politically, and I would say that, wouldn't I, as a neutral public servant? But I think that the kind of polarization you're seeing needs people like you to start thinking through where the pathways are for your generation. We've hit on all the big challenges, from climate to migration, hunger, war. I'm sorry that we're handing that on to you as an agenda, but please look to your public service as ways that you can help to address all of that. So thank you for listening this morning. Thanks.